Welcome to Victorian spinsterhood. You're 30, unmarried, and unsettlingly content. While others whisper, you sip your tea, stroke the cat in your lap, and wonder how marriage ever became the goal. They call it a wasted life. You call it the best decision you never made, but change is coming. Printed in bold, folded neatly, and addressed to unmarried women of good character. If you enjoy drifting off to stories where women quietly rewrote the rules instead of following them, hit that like button and subscribe for more delightfully defiant bedtime tales. This episode is part of our Victorian series, a cosy collection of bedtime stories exploring the most bizarre, baffling, and quietly rebellious lives of the 19th century. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly soothing about drifting off to tales of lace, judgment, and politely ignored expectations. Now dim the lights, get cosy, and prepare to enter a world where spinsterhood wasn't surrender. It was strategy. You're not married, not even a little bit, and what's worse, according to your aunt, you don't seem bothered by it. She wrings her hands. She mutters about your womb's dwindling shelf life. She invites over a bachelor so eligible he has gout in both feet, and a firm belief that women shouldn't vote because their brains are spongy. You smile sweetly while picturing his wig catching fire from the gas lamp. He's here to offer you a future, one where you bear 9 children, lose your name, and spend the rest of your days being referred to as the wife of the man who once owned a shipping warehouse. Tempting, truly. But you have a cat named Lord Picklesworth who brings more to the table, namely silence, affection, and the ability to clean himself. You could marry. Of course you could. You've had offers. One man was a chimney sweep with 5 children and a mysterious wet cough. Another said you had a sturdy ankle, which is exactly what every girl dreams of hearing before committing to a lifetime of unpaid domestic labour. Instead, you sleep diagonally in your own bed, eat cake for dinner, and spend your evenings reading novels without someone breathing onion behind you and explaining what the author really meant. You have opinions, you express them. No one interrupts to say, "Well, actually, my dear," and the best part? You can do whatever you want whenever you want without first checking if a man in the room thinks it's sensible. You don't need permission to learn French, take up oil painting, or spend 10 guineas on an imported hair tonic that smells like violets and revenge. There aren't enough men to go around anyway, and frankly, even if there were, you're not sharing your bathwater, your library, or your inheritance with someone who calls your career a charming little distraction. You're unmarried, unbothered, and undeniably thriving. Statistically speaking, if you were a woman in Victorian Britain and you weren't married, congratulations. You were in excellent company. The 1851 census revealed over 500,000 more women than men in England. That's not a gap, that's a canyon. The newspapers called it a crisis. Society called it a problem, and your mother called it your fault. But the truth was simpler. Men kept dying. In wars, in mines, in factories, on boats, under horses, occasionally just from walking into things while mansplaining the stock market. Others packed up and sailed off to the colonies in pursuit of gold, land, or just fewer women with opinions. That left behind a nation full of women who were by all accounts quite brilliant and quite done waiting. The spinster population soared, not because women were undesirable, but because the pool of potential husbands had evaporated faster than a clergyman's hairline. This sparked what Victorian bean counters politely referred to as the surplus woman problem. The Times ran anxious articles. Pamphlets fluttered through drawing rooms with helpful suggestions like, "Why not ship the ladies to Canada?" as if women were furniture or unwanted houseplants that could be rehomed. One well-meaning gentleman even suggested relocating them to Australia to marry lonely settlers. But the settlers were also men, and the women, having already met men, respectfully declined. Yet here's the part the newspapers missed entirely. Many of these women weren't heartbroken. They were thrilled. They didn't have to listen to snoring. They didn't have to risk dying in childbirth, or spend decades being referred to as mother, like their actual name had been misplaced in a cupboard. These so-called surplus women were in many cases highly educated, independent, and delightfully uninterested in becoming someone's second best choice. They were not pining, they were thriving. And the sheer volume of them sent Victorian society into a full-blown moral tailspin. Because if so many women were skipping marriage altogether, what on earth was going to happen when they turned 24? You turn 24 and suddenly every conversation starts with, "Have you met the new curate?" and ends with someone handing you a pamphlet about spinsterhood as if it's leprosy. Your uncle mutters something about good-breeding hips over breakfast. Your mother leaves out a bridal magazine as if it's a coded cry for help. You try to be gracious, but it's difficult when you're being treated like expired cheese at a marriage market. At your birthday gathering, your cousin gets engaged for the third time. She announces it while holding up a ring the size of a walnut and giggling like it's contagious. Everyone claps. You open your own gift, a book titled How to Accept God's Plan for Your Solitary Life. Later that evening, you sit in the drawing room beside a roaring fire, stroking your cat, Lady Vengeance, and contemplating whether you should get another degree or just train your pet to attack on command. You're not lonely. You're just enjoying the unparalleled bliss of not being legally obligated to endure someone else's foot odour for eternity. Someone asks if you're worried about dying alone. You quote Miss Laura Bax, who once compared matrimony to an electric battery. When you once join hands, you can't let go, however much it hurts. Then you take a long sip of sherry and smile with every tooth. You've seen what married life looks like. The desperation, the surprise babies, the husbands who act like handing you a cold teacup is a love language. As Miss Sparrow once said, men are less docile than a dog, less affectionate than a cat, and less amusing than a monkey. And frankly, you'd rather share your home with a loud goose than a man who corrects your piano playing. You are not married. You are not trying to be. And contrary to popular belief, you are not crying about it into a monogrammed handkerchief. You're 24, gloriously untethered, and actively avoiding any situation that ends with you being described as the wife of a man who enjoys turnips and silence. In modern terms, 24 is when you're still figuring out if your eyebrows are supposed to match. In Victorian England, 24 meant your reproductive window had slammed shut and nailed itself closed out of spite. There was no universal rule for when a woman officially became a spinster, but Victorian society operated on vibes, and those vibes said if you weren't married by your early 20s, you were clearly defective, or cursed, or worse, opinionated. Etiquette guides gave you until roughly 22 if you had a chin, 25 if you had money, and if you hit 30, best start knitting burial shrouds and answering to Auntie who never smiles. The newspapers didn't help. They clutched their pearls over the alarming rise of old maids. The Illustrated London News described them as withering reminders of social decay, failing to mention they were also running shops, funding schools and looking fantastic in lace. But here's what society couldn't wrap its powdered little head around. Many of these women weren't lonely, bitter, or starved for affection. They were thrilled to have dodged the matrimonial meat grinder. Take the infamous 1889 Tits magazine poll, where single women were asked why they chose spinsterhood. Miss Florence Waite responded that she had other professions open to me in which the hours are shorter, the work more agreeable, and the pay possibly better. Translation: she didn't want to be a full-time unpaid wife/nurse/maid/hostage. Miss Laura Bax, an early prophet of the single-life gospel, warned readers that marriage was like an electric battery. You can't let go once you grab on, even when it hurts. And Miss Sparrow, living legend, wrote, I do not care to enlarge my menagerie of pets, and I find the animal man less docile than a dog, less affectionate than a cat, and less amusing than a monkey. Victorian society may have tried to shame her, but Miss Sparrow was already in her chaise lounge, petting her monkey, sipping brandy, and not giving a single fig. And why should they care? The average Victorian marriage came with no legal rights, no personal property, and a statistically generous helping of death in childbirth. Staying single was less a failure than a strategic withdrawal. The idea that women might choose singleness scandalised the patriarchy. If women could be happy, truly, radiantly happy, without husbands, what else might they do? Get jobs, read philosophy, Start publishing angry pamphlets about men being less amusing than monkeys. The horror! And so, panicked men with publishing contracts began asking the same urgent question. What in God's name are we supposed to do with all these unmarried women? You're at a garden party surrounded by married women blinking in Morse code for help. One whispers that her husband makes a slurping sound every time he eats soup. Another hasn't read a novel in 6 years because George says stories make women hysterical. A third says she pretends to faint just to avoid marital relations on Tuesdays. They look at you with the wide, glassy eyes of someone watching a ship sail away from a burning island. You are that ship. You, with your unmarried freedom, your silk gloves, your untouched casserole dish, and your 0 legal obligations to a man who thinks sneezing is foreplay. Someone asks if you're ever worried you'll end up alone. You take a slow sip of lemonade and quote Miss Florence Waite, who famously said she avoided marriage because the hours were better, the work more agreeable, and the pay possibly superior. You then excuse yourself to go read in the shade, alone, with joy. These days, you're done pretending to be pitied. You're not a tragedy, you're a lifestyle brand. And if one more person refers to you as poor Miss whatever her name is, you're going to embroider the phrase happily unclaimed onto a decorative pillow and hit them with it. By the late 1800s, something remarkable happened. Spinsters stopped accepting society's pity and started writing back. Unmarried women began responding publicly to condescending essays, marriage-obsessed editorials, and nosy letters asking whether they wept alone at night. Spoiler, they didn't. In 1869, English essayist William Rathbone Gregg published a wildly hand-wringy piece titled, "Why Are Women Redundant?" His theory: there were simply too many unwed women lying around Britain like decorative vases, and they should all be shipped off to the colonies to become wives for lonely settlers. One can assume he believed this would solve both imperial expansion and his personal discomfort with female independence. The reaction was swift, sharp, and dripping with Victorian shade. Writer Frances Power Cobbe responded with her own essay, "What Shall We Do with Our Old Maids?", in which she pointed out, with all the grace of a woman 2 seconds from flipping a tea table, that maybe the problem wasn't surplus women, but surplus assumptions. She noted that 1 in 4 women would never marry, and that over 3 million were already earning their own living in England. Why force them into marriage like a herd of corseted sheep when they could be educated, employed, and, heaven forbid, content? This was the start of something bigger. These weren't just spinsters, they were strategists. They recognised that singlehood wasn't a sad accident. It was a crack in the system through which freedom, progress, and a truly satisfying hobby collection could flourish. Magazines like Tits, The Ladies' World, and the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine began printing more submissions from unmarried women. Not weepy ones, spicy ones. These women weren't sobbing. They were sabring the social narrative with sarcasm. They weren't shrinking in shame. They were writing essays, hosting salons, making money, living well, and every time someone called them redundant, they published a column that said, essentially, kindly sit on a thistle. And so the spinster, once a silent shadow in the corner of a family portrait, picked up her pen, her voice, and sometimes her umbrella, and made it abundantly clear she was not lonely. She was not bitter, and she certainly was not available. Still, not everyone was ready for a world where women didn't rely on marriage to survive. And when reality came knocking, the patriarchy responded the only way it knew how, with panic, pamphlets, and unsolicited advice. You're enjoying a perfectly pleasant afternoon, tea, scones, 0 husbands, when you spot something awful wedged between the pages of your copy of Manners and Mending for the Modern Lady. It's a pamphlet. The title reads, "A Practical Solution to the Surplus Woman Problem, Matrimony in the Colonies." Subtitle, "Make Yourself Useful Where There's a Shortage of Wives and an Abundance of Mud." You flip through it, horrified. There are cheerful illustrations of women boarding ships like they're off to a spa, not to marry a man named Reginald, who's been eating salted meat for 6 years and hasn't blinked since 1874. According to the author, your singleness is not an asset, it's a waste. And the most helpful thing you can do for society is to ship yourself to the colonies and comfort some poor bachelor who's been alone so long he's forgotten how to pronounce please. You laugh so hard you nearly drop your crumpet. You've met enough men to know exactly what this offer entails. A lifetime of hard labour, emotional suppression, and someone muttering, "not all men," while you bleed out during childbirth. You know the type. The man who trims his nose hair at the breakfast table. The one who calls your embroidery cute, and then tries to sell it for beer money. The one who thinks your uterus should double as a crock pot. No, thank you. You already live in a house without constant unsolicited opinions, foot smells, or anyone asking where the sugar is when it is very obviously right there on the tray. You come and go as you please. You own 2 tea sets. Your cat blinks with more emotional intelligence than the average suitor. You're not surplus. You're limited edition. And if the British Empire thinks you're going to climb aboard a boat just to ladle stew for a sunburnt stranger with opinions about women's ankles, it can go colonise someone else. As the surplus woman crisis grew louder in Victorian England, the government and media began offering solutions, most of which involved putting women on boats and sending them far, far away. The idea was simple. Too many women, not enough men. Ship the ladies out. Essays like William Rathbone, Greg's Why Are Women Redundant, argued that thousands of unmarried women were loitering in the drawing rooms of Britain, tragically unused like decorative soaps. His proposal? Relocate them to the colonies, Australia, Canada, South Africa, where lonely settlers, in desperate need of wives and dinner, awaited them like unclaimed mail. It was not pitched as an opportunity, it was pitched as a duty. These women, after all, had failed to secure husbands at home. Surely they'd leap at the chance to marry sweaty strangers on the other side of the globe. Spoiler, many did not leap. Sure, some women, especially those in difficult economic positions, chose emigration for a shot at stability. But the narrative that single women could only be fixed by forced export didn't sit well with everyone, particularly the single women. Frances Power Cobb, in her essay What Shall We Do with Our Old Maids, took the entire premise out behind the barn and metaphorically set it on fire. She argued that women should not be punished for remaining single, nor treated like defective merchandise clogging the national marriage shelves. Instead, she suggested investing in women's education, employment, and rights. A scandalous idea that somehow didn't involve shipping them like barrels of salted cod. Unsurprisingly, men were horrified. Give women choices, independence. Next thing you know, they'd want land, opinions, or worse, access to pocket money. And yet, the real fear wasn't about logistics. It was about what spinsterhood represented. A woman who didn't need a husband to function, or travel, or live well, or laugh without permission. So while society drafted shipping labels for its unwed daughters, many of those daughters quietly, defiantly stayed put. They built careers, they ran households, they hosted salons, they inherited fortunes, they bought cats in pairs, and when someone suggested they'd be happier in the colonies, they smiled sweetly and responded, "Wouldn't you?" Because if a woman could be single, successful, and absolutely nowhere near a man, it raised a bigger, scarier question. What exactly was the point of marriage in the first place? You're at the bookshop browsing for scandalous French novels when you accidentally knock over a display of pamphlets titled Marriage, a Woman's Highest Calling, subtitled Also Her Most Immediate Exit Strategy. You flip it open and discover a watercolour of a woman blissfully ironing her husband's trousers while he reads the newspaper upside down and complains about gravy. It's unclear if she's in love or in shock. You, meanwhile, are not married. You sleep alone, on purpose. You make your own money, eat jam straight from the jar, and the only man in your house is your cat, who respects boundaries and doesn't try to explain taxes to you. Your cousin just married for love. Her husband gave her a comb for their anniversary and asked if she'd wear less personality around his friends. She said yes. You said absolutely not, and bought yourself a second teapot. People keep telling you love is worth it. But worth it sounds suspiciously like crying in a pantry, while your husband plays the violin badly and asks why the beef is grey. You've seen what Victorian love looks like. Courtship letters, blushing glances, and then boom, 30 years of being called mother, by a man who eats like he's punishing the food. You don't want a soulmate. You want sole control over the bookshelf, the bank account, and the breakfast schedule. You're not against love. You just don't think it should come with laundry and death in childbirth. By the mid-1800s, Victorian society had decided marriage should be romantic. Because what better foundation for legal subjugation than vibes? Before this, marriage was a transaction. Dowry, land, goats, the usual. But as novels and poetry bled into real life, people started insisting on marrying for love, which turned out to be Victorian for marrying someone who quotes Byron and then dies in a boating accident. Women were told it was their destiny, that true love would find them, save them, and give their life meaning. No one mentioned it would also give them gouty in-laws, endless pregnancies, and a husband who sulked when dinner wasn't exciting. Marrying for love didn't come with protections. It just came with more chores and fewer excuses. A married woman became a legal ghost. Her property? Gone. Her wages? His. Her rights? Please stop asking. Her corset? Still too tight. And yet spinsters saw the marketing and said, hard pass. In an 1889 issue of Tits magazine, a reader wrote, "I have observed many husbands. I prefer a good broomstick." Another proudly declared, "I have a cat, a library, and the absence of a man who confuses baking soda with salt. I am complete." Miss Laura Bax compared marriage to grabbing a live wire and hoping for the best. Miss Sparrow said men were less docile than a dog, less affectionate than a cat, and less amusing than a monkey. And still, society kept trying to convince women that this was the dream. Meanwhile, newspapers like The Times published letters from newlywed women, politely asking if murder was still illegal, or if it was fine just the once. The truth was painfully clear. Love was not a guarantee of happiness. It was not even a guarantee of basic hygiene. For many women, it was a trap with doilies on top. And spinsterhood? It wasn't a fallback. It was freedom with better upholstery. Because once women stopped believing in romantic salvation, they started asking for something far more dangerous. Choices. You're at a tea party, smiling politely, when someone says, "Well, women don't really need education. You'll just get married anyway." You laugh. Not a cute ladylike titter. A deep, terrifying laugh that makes the doilies tremble. You're not married. You're educated. And you've just beaten everyone at parlour trivia, out-debated the vicar on political theory, and corrected the host's Latin on her invitation cards. You also own a small but loyal army of cats. Their resumes are stronger than half the men here. Someone else chimes in. Why do women need rights when they already have so many duties? You make eye contact so intensely he drops a teacup. Somewhere a monocle shatters. You didn't plan to become a social problem. You just asked a few casual questions, like why your brother can vote while struggling to spell his own name, or why a man who confuses starch with sugar gets to own property and you don't. Now everyone's panicking like you've set fire to the curtains. You haven't. Yet. You, dear listener, are what the newspapers are calling the woman question, and you have entered the chat wearing your best gloves, holding a quill like a weapon, and absolutely spoiling for an intellectual duel. You're not here to be delicate. You're here to be dangerous. You've brought notes. You've highlighted your points. And you're not afraid to use big words in a high-pitched voice. They wanted quiet. They got calculus. In Victorian England, the woman question referred to a bundle of unsettling inquiries society really hoped women would stop asking. Questions like, why are women denied higher education? Why can't married women own property? Why is my legal existence wiped out because I said I do? And while we're at it, why is my brother allowed to run a business when he can't spell business? These questions, once whispered in sewing circles, began showing up in essays, public lectures and awkward dinner conversations that ended with someone suddenly remembering a carriage. The idea that women might want more than marriage caused a collective male fainting spell that lasted most of the 19th century. Writers like Frances Power Cobbe, Harriet Martineau, and Barbara Bodichon didn't just raise questions, they fired them like cannonballs into the parlour. They argued for women's education, property rights, suffrage, and something truly radical, being taken seriously while wearing skirts. By the 1870s, women's colleges began sprouting up. Somerville, Girton, Newnham, offering actual degrees, or at the very least the right to sit in a room and learn things without a man shouting "science is dangerous" from a window. Naturally, society panicked. What if education made women unfit for marriage? What if women who read books became too confident to marry men who didn't? What if the entire social order collapsed and ladies started saying things like, "I'd rather not"? The Times ran editorials wringing their hands over the rise of the clever woman. Punch magazine printed cartoons of women with spectacles and opinions, both considered deeply unattractive, and one poor soul predicted that educated women would become cold, dry, and unable to love. Oddly enough, none of those things happened. Instead, educated women began running schools, writing books, running charities, and terrifying men in debates. And while not all of them were spinsters, many spinsters became the loudest voices in the room. Why? Because they didn't have to ask a husband for permission, or explain why they were skipping church to speak at a rally. The woman question wasn't just about politics, it was about possibility. And for the first time, spinsterhood wasn't a sad little footnote, it was a launch pad. Because a woman who doesn't need a husband might just start needing answers, and once a woman asks a question, she tends to follow it up with something far more dangerous: a career. You've just finished writing a particularly savage essay titled "Why Marriage is Just Housekeeping with Penalties," when your neighbour arrives uninvited and deeply concerned. She says your new hobby, publishing, is making people nervous. You say, "Good. You've always wanted to cause a scandal using only ink and contempt." The editor at Ladies' Weekly Genteel Gazette sent back your last submission with the note, "Well written, but possibly too upsetting for fragile readers. You're planning to use it as a pull quote on your gravestone. You're unmarried, overeducated, and positively bursting with literary opinions. Which is to say, you're the clergy's worst nightmare and the printer's best customer. Every morning you wake up thrilled to know that no one can tell you what to do unless they're paying you per word. You own 3 fountain pens, a second-hand typewriter, and a cat named Plot Twist, who sits on rejection letters like a loyal emotional support editor. You're not interested in a husband who'll interrupt your novel with a request for boiled carrots. You want complete silence, a desk by a window, and maybe the occasional man who drops off cash and leaves immediately. You don't daydream about wedding bells. You fantasize about footnotes. Your cousin says women like you are too much. You thank her. Then you go back to writing an op-ed titled "Too Much Too Educated and Too Unbothered." The Victorians liked their women like they liked their furniture: decorative, silent, and unlikely to publish essays on land reform. Unfortunately for them, spinsters learned to write. As education improved and middle-class women gained literacy, thousands began doing something shocking: putting thoughts on paper and mailing them to editors. Magazines like the English Woman's Domestic Magazine, Tits, The Ladies' Realm, and the Fortnightly Review started receiving a flood of letters and articles from women with brains, time, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Many of these writers were unmarried, and it showed. Their work was bold, biting, and gloriously fed up. They wrote about unfair divorce laws, suffrage, marriage inequality, domestic abuse, and the soul-crushing horror of being called mother by a man you once found charming. And they didn't ask for permission. Frances Power Cobb was out here writing about women's legal rights while being, quite literally, nobody's wife. Harriet Martineau took a break from translating French philosophy to casually reshape British sociology, single, deaf, and unbothered. Barbara Bodishin co-founded Girton College and still found time to roast marriage laws in print, with the energy of a woman who'd seen one too many husbands misplace their socks. Meanwhile, people panicked. Editorials warned that too much thinking would shrink a woman's womb. Cartoons in Punch showed lady scholars scaring off suitors with Latin phrases and full sets of teeth. Critics feared these women would become unsexed. Most of the women said, "Perfect. That'll give us more time to write." And they didn't stop at words. Spinsters were founding schools, running publishing houses, training nurses, launching suffrage societies, and absolutely demolishing the idea that unmarried meant unimportant. Their motto wasn't "why me," it was "try me." And while society clutched its pearls, these women kept sharpening their quills. Because when you give a woman a room of her own, a steady supply of tea, and no man breathing over her shoulder, she doesn't wilt. She writes history. And while others feared solitude, these women embraced it, turning their independence into power and their quiet lives into a masterclass in not needing anyone's approval. You wake up at 9:30 because you felt like it. No one asked you where the crumpets are. No one breathed heavily next to you all night like a haunted bellows. No one demanded eggs, praise, or affection before noon. You're not alone. You're unsupervised. And you've never felt more powerful. Your hair is up because you want it up. You're wearing your favourite slippers and your third favourite scowl. The house is quiet. Your cat, Chairman Meow, approves of your schedule. The maid is terrified of you, which you find deeply satisfying. You have breakfast alone with your thoughts, your newspaper, and the butter dish you don't have to share with someone who doesn't believe in germs. Your friends, well, your married friends, keep asking if you're lonely. You assume this is projection. One of them recently confessed she hides in the pantry to eat jam in peace. Another has developed a mysterious headache that coincides perfectly with Tuesdays, Thursdays, and every day ending in Y. Meanwhile, your afternoons are full. Books, letters, embroidery, possibly witchcraft. You light candles when you want ambience, not because some man said gaslighting is a man's job. At night you go to bed when you please, surrounded by pillows you bought yourself and dreams that don't snore. And if this is loneliness, you hope it lasts forever. Victorian society feared one thing above all else: a woman who was alone and liked it. Spinsterhood wasn't just a social anomaly, it was a spiritual crisis. Surely a woman without a husband must be miserable, aimless, and at risk of adopting too many cats. Except she wasn't. In truth, many single women found their lives delightfully full. They had routines, incomes, hobbies, secret recipes, monogrammed linen, and a distinct lack of male interruption. And unlike their married counterparts, they had one precious luxury: time. Time to read, time to rest, time to become experts in astronomy, languages, or herb-based revenge, time to travel, time to not die in childbirth. Newspapers occasionally tried to warn them, unmarried women at risk of melancholy. But the women featured in these articles were often too busy having opinions and organising lectures to be properly despondent. In fact, the melancholy spinster trope was mostly fiction, popular with men who needed to believe that rejection came with consequences. But rejection had perks. Spinster women lived longer. They weren't subjected to dangerous pregnancies. They didn't have to manage the emotions of grown men who cried when their meat was overcooked. They didn't die from exhaustion. They didn't beg for school fees, and they never had to pretend to enjoy parlour games involving handbells. Some women even formed intentional spinster households, living with sisters, cousins, or fellow unclaimed legends. They pooled incomes, divided chores, adopted cats, and essentially invented modern roommate culture. Only with better gowns. These women weren't social rejects, they were domestic visionaries, and the best part? No one told them to smile more. They smiled when they felt like it, usually while sipping sherry and watching their married friends look longingly at the quiet. Because as these women embraced independence, they discovered something even more delicious than solitude: control over their own money. You carry your own purse. Not one of those decorative little reticules for smelling salts and flirtation cards, but a real one, heavy, practical, lined with coins and confidence. You know how much sugar costs. You know the price of coal. You know which tenants are late with rent and how much you made from your last essay. You know things most men assume women shouldn't worry their little heads about. And you're not married, which means you still own your head, legally. Your cousin recently asked whether it was lonely handling your own finances. She asked this while her husband stood next to her, explaining compound interest incorrectly and wiping gravy on his cravat. You are not lonely. You're unburdened. You make your own purchases. You pay your own bills. You decide how many biscuits you need for the winter. And you don't have to defend your choices to a man who thinks money is just a feeling. They used to call women like you dangerous. You prefer unsupervised and solvent. Miss Harriet Hosmer, successful sculptor and lifelong bachelorette, once said, I honour every woman who has strength enough to step out of the beaten path. You keep that quote in your ledger, just under your list of monthly income sources and notes on who still owes you postage. For much of the Victorian era, a woman's legal identity and all her money disappeared the moment she said, "I do." Under English common law, married women couldn't own property, sign contracts, or control their earnings. A woman's dowry, inheritance, or salary became her husband's, even if she made it herself, even if he squandered it. This wasn't an oversight, it was the system. Single women, however, especially those labelled spinsters, retained full legal autonomy. They could inherit, invest, and manage businesses. They could lease property or buy it outright. They could sue and be sued. They paid taxes, donated to causes, and in many cases supported entire families. It was spinsterhood, not marriage, that offered true financial freedom. That contrast became hard to ignore. In 1854, Barbara Lee Smith Bodishon, a lifelong single woman and legal reformer, published a scathing pamphlet called A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws Concerning Women. It explained, in plain English, that the law treated married women as legal non-entities, and it did not mince words. Bodishon and her peers lobbied relentlessly for reform. After years of campaigning, Parliament passed the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, allowing married women to keep wages they earned after marriage. Later versions expanded those rights, but only in stages. Meanwhile, single women had been managing their affairs for decades, often more capably than their male relatives. Many ran boarding houses, schools, shops, and publishing ventures. Others lived quietly on investment returns, collecting rent and keeping their receipts in tidy drawers no husband ever rifled through. Financial independence changed how women lived, and for many spinsters it was the very thing that made a traditional marriage unnecessary. Because once you could write your own cheques, sign your own contracts, and buy your own house, the appeal of asking a man's permission for anything started to wear very, very thin. And as these women managed their money, many began demanding something more valuable than income or property, something their government had long refused to give them: a voice. You're reading the Times when you come across yet another editorial explaining why women shouldn't vote. This one says women are too emotional to make rational political decisions. You place the paper down, slowly, like it's contagious. This, you recall, was written by a man who once cried openly in church because someone took the last scone. Apparently a uterus disqualifies you from understanding taxation, but an ulcer and a family history of shouting at geese is perfectly acceptable in a member of Parliament. You don't have the right to vote, but you do have the right to write strongly worded letters, organise meetings, and turn tea into a revolutionary act. You show up at suffrage gatherings with ink on your fingers and a look in your eye that says, "I am exactly the kind of woman you're worried about." Your married friends would come too, if they didn't have to get approval from husbands who think politics is too rough for women, but believe gout should be debated publicly and at length. You're not too emotional, you're too informed. As Caroline Norton once said, "I speak because I do not have the power to remain silent." You speak because someone at last week's committee meeting said, "Women voting might make the sun fall out of the sky." At this point you'd vote just to spite that man, and you'd wear your best hat to do it. Victorian England was, to put it mildly, not in a rush to let women vote. The prevailing argument was that women were too delicate for politics, despite managing households, finances, tenant disputes, childbirth, and emotional damage caused by amateur poetry. Legally, married women had almost no political rights, but unmarried women, spinsters, were a different story. With their own legal identities, property and income, they had room to speak, and they did. When John Stuart Mill presented the first women's suffrage petition to Parliament in 1866, many of the signers were single women, teachers, writers, landowners, and reformers who didn't need to ask anyone's permission. Barbara Lee Smith Bodishon co-founded the suffrage committee. She was unmarried, financially independent, and absolutely done being polite about injustice. Lydia Becker edited the Women's Suffrage Journal and believed women should not only vote, they should run for office, run the meetings, and run circles around the men who said they couldn't. And then there were the newspapers. Punch magazine, ever helpful, publish cartoons warning that women with votes would grow moustaches, develop harsh voices, and frighten gentlemen callers. Political cartoons often featured single women as the punchline, as if not being married was inherently hilarious. Spinsters responded by publishing more essays, hosting more lectures, and raising more money than most political parties knew what to do with. And while they didn't win the national vote during the Victorian era, they made serious gains. Single women gained the right to vote in local elections starting in the 1860s. They served on school boards and poor law unions. They spoke at public debates. They made noise. Importantly, they could make noise because they weren't legally bound to husbands who might object. Spinsterhood wasn't just personal freedom, it was political power. Because if you can't vote in the system, but you can print pamphlets, raise funds, and terrify a minister with your reading comprehension, you're doing just fine. And as spinsters challenged Parliament and rewrote the rules, they also transformed something far closer to home. What it meant to live well, live independently, and live without asking anyone else for the house key. You close your front door. Your front door. No one stomps in behind you demanding to know why dinner isn't more exciting. No boots are dumped in the hallway. No coat is flung over the back of your favourite chair. The slippers by the fire, yours. The armchair, yours. The tea tray, entirely yours, and miraculously free of someone else's cigar ash. Victorians like to whisper that a house without a man is empty, and yet here you are, stretched across the sofa with a book, a cat, and the thrilling knowledge that no one will interrupt you to explain the Corn Laws. Your married cousin insists, a home doesn't feel complete without a husband. You've seen her home. It feels complete with shouting, misplaced laundry, and a man who keeps rearranging the furniture for efficiency. Meanwhile, your parlour is arranged exactly as you like it. Your writing desk is locked because it's your desk, not a communal dumping ground for unpaid bills and pipe cleaners. Your pantry contains only food you enjoy. No one has hidden sausages behind the flour. Elizabeth Barrett Browning once wrote, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways you prefer. How do I love thee, quiet house with no man sneezing into the stew? Let me count the chairs still in their proper place. They call you a spinster. You call yourself blissfully unbothered." The stereotype of the lonely old maid in her dreary parlour was popular in Victorian jokes and newspapers, but the reality, many spinsters had homes that were the envy of their married peers. Unmarried women with property or income could maintain their own households. Some lived alone, some with sisters or friends, creating what were essentially early shared flats, only with better manners and more tea. These spaces weren't silent mausoleums. They were often lively hubs of reading groups, suffrage meetings, or evenings of needlework punctuated by gossip and laughter. The absence of a husband meant control. A married woman had no legal authority over her household's property. Everything, from the sofa to the spoons, belonged to her husband. But a spinster could buy furniture, collect rent, and decorate without anyone announcing that green wallpaper is unmanly. Writers and reformers often valued their private space. Charlotte Bronte guarded her writing room fiercely. Florence Nightingale ran her household like an administrative headquarters. Barbara Bodichon hosted political discussions in her parlour. Each of them demonstrated the power of a woman controlling her own four walls. Later, Virginia Woolf would famously argue that women needed a room of one's own. Victorian spinsters already understood this. They had turned their rooms into sanctuaries, workplaces, and safe havens long before Woolf put it into print. So while cartoons mocked spinsters knitting in silence, the truth was less gloomy and far more enviable. They had their own space, their own keys, and their own peace, which frankly is more than most married women could say. And once spinsters had their houses in order, they didn't just stop at quiet evenings by the fire. They opened their doors, and their purses, to reshape their communities. You're at a tea party minding your own business, sipping weak Darjeeling, when someone's aunt leans over and whispers, "Such a shame you never married. You must be dreadfully lonely." You blink at her. You live in a house you paid for, full of books you chose, with biscuits you don't share. Lonely? You've never been busier. Of course, this is the stereotype, the dreaded old maid. According to the magazines, you're supposed to be knitting alone in a dusty parlour, scaring neighbourhood children with your grim expression and speaking only to cats. Which is funny, because the only thing you've scared lately is the local vicar when you corrected his Latin quotation in front of the bishop. Wealthy women like you were mocked as eccentric spinsters, rattling around in big houses with too many servants and not enough husbands. Poorer women, meanwhile, got the same insult but with far less comfortable furniture. Either way, society decided to laugh at you, and yet, when you look around, it's hard not to notice you're the one actually thriving. For middle and upper class women, the spinster stereotype often meant ridicule in the press. Punch magazine ran cartoons of redundant women haunting parlours, clinging to pets, and scowling at married couples. Novels portrayed them as bitter, nosy, or laughable. But the reality was often quite different. Wealthy spinsters like Barbara Bodishan, Florence Nightingale, and Octavia Hill used their independence to fund schools, hospitals, and housing projects. They weren't lonely. They were busy. Many lived comfortably on inheritances or investments. Some maintained large households with servants. Others hosted salons and reading groups. They didn't fit the caricature of dusty old maids. They looked far more like administrators, patrons, and leaders. The stereotype of wealthy spinsters as useless was, in truth, a way to make powerful, independent women seem less threatening. For poorer, unmarried women, the picture was harsher. Without property or income, many had to work as seamstresses, governesses, domestic servants, shop assistants, or factory labourers. Their lives were far less secure, and poverty loomed large. Society mocked them too, though differently. They were cast as pitiable, old maids in garrets, figures of loneliness and failure. Fiction often portrayed them as comic relief or as sad cautionary tales, yet poor spinsters also contributed enormously. They kept industries running, raised nieces and nephews, taught in schools and supported charities. In boarding houses and shared lodgings, they built informal communities of unmarried women who worked, socialised and survived together. They may not have had the financial safety of their wealthier counterparts, but they weren't simply waiting for marriage proposals that never came. They were working, adapting, and in many cases enjoying the small independence that came from not having to share a wage with a husband. It's striking how the stereotypes worked. Wealthy spinsters were mocked for being too independent. Poor spinsters were mocked for being not independent enough. In both cases, society turned unmarried women into a joke, regardless of their actual lives. The truth was less funny for the Victorians and more uncomfortable. Spinsters were visible. They were present. They were living outside the expected script, whether in comfort or in hardship. And that made people nervous, because if women could live without men, rich or poor, then what exactly were husbands for? And the longer spinsters refused to play the roles written for them, the more obvious it became. The joke wasn't on them. It was on the people who underestimated them. You open the latest Punch magazine and, oh look, another cartoon of the hopeless old maid. This one has you clutching a cat like it's your only friend, glaring into the void, knitting your way to irrelevance. You laugh so hard you nearly drop your tea. Last week you raised funds for a new school, wrote an essay that made 2 MPs splutter, and bought curtains without consulting a single husband. If that's loneliness, then may you die with a cat in each hand and velvet drapes at your funeral. At social gatherings they call you poor Miss So-and-so. Poor. You have savings, a quiet house, and no one demanding that you darn socks at midnight. Meanwhile, your married cousin has to ask permission before she buys sugar. The stereotype insists wealthy spinsters like you are wasting away in cavernous parlours. Poorer spinsters, they say, waste away in cramped garrets. Apparently, the only universal rule is, if you don't have a husband, you must be wasting away somewhere. You take another bite of cake. If this is wasting away, please bring a larger plate. Victorian society adored mocking spinsters. Newspapers and magazines churned out caricatures of lonely, bitter women, either rattling around in empty houses with too many pets, or hunched in attic rooms with too little food. The reality was less tragic, and much more inconvenient for the patriarchy. Wealthy spinsters often lived quite well. Women like Barbara Bodishan, Florence Nightingale, and Octavia Hill used their independence to fund charities, schools and housing reform. Yet satirical papers still insisted they were redundant. Redundant, apparently, while running hospitals and reform committees men couldn't manage. Poor spinsters had fewer comforts but more resilience than their stereotypes suggested. Many worked as teachers, seamstresses, governesses or shop assistants. They lived with sisters, cousins or fellow boarders, pooling incomes to build small but stable households. They weren't tragic heroines in dusty garrets. They were holding entire communities together while being laughed at in the press. The absurdity was striking. Rich spinsters were mocked for enjoying independence. Poor spinsters were mocked for not enjoying poverty. In short, if you were a woman and unmarried, society always found a reason to sneer. But the sneer looked thinner each year, because whether they were sipping tea in well-furnished parlours or sewing late at night to pay rent, spinsters kept proving they weren't invisible. They were working, earning, organising, and often living longer, healthier, and, let's be honest, far less irritated lives than many married women. The cartoonists might have had their fun, but history shows the joke was never on the spinsters. Because the louder society laughed, the more obvious it became. They weren't laughing at failure. They were laughing out of fear. Fear that women could live, thrive and succeed without marriage at all. You're hosting a dinner party. The menu is yours. The guest list is yours. The wine is yours. No man has leaned over the table to explain the proper way to carve beef, because there is no man here. And the beef, you didn't cook it. You hired someone else to do it. Around your table sit fellow spinsters, teachers, nurses, writers, and one woman who just returned from cycling across the continent, scandalously wearing trousers. The conversation is quick, clever, and gloriously uninterrupted by anyone clearing their throat to remind you that ladies should stick to novels. Meanwhile, across town, your poorer sisters in spinsterhood are sharing a boarding house. They pull wages from teaching, sewing, or shop work. Dinner isn't beef with wine, it's bread and tea, but they laugh just as loudly, and no one is interrupting them either. Their freedom may be smaller in scale, but it's just as sweet. This is not loneliness. This is not tragedy. This is community. And when someone says spinsters are redundant, you all raise your glasses, or teacups, and toast to being redundant, and then, with a grin, to being absolutely indispensable. By the late Victorian era, the stereotype of the sad old maid was wearing thin. Spinsters weren't quietly fading into irrelevance. They were rebranding. For wealthy and middle-class women, spinsterhood increasingly overlapped with the image of the new woman. Educated, independent, cycling around town, teaching classes, publishing essays, and running charities. Magazines like The Ladies' Realm profiled single women who were teachers, doctors, or reformers. Women who didn't wait for marriage to give their lives meaning. Poorer spinsters lived a different reality. Without inheritances or investments, many worked in dress shops, schools, offices, or factories. They endured long hours and low wages, but even so, they carved out small spaces of independence. Boarding houses became havens where women supported each other, pooling rent and sharing meals. For these women, spinsterhood was not glamorous, but it still meant one vital thing: freedom from relying on a husband who might spend wages at the pub or disappear altogether. Society, of course, still tried to mock them. Wealthy spinsters were caricatured as eccentric and selfish, poorer spinsters as pitiful and unwanted. But the truth was harder to laugh at. Wealthy spinsters were running schools and reform committees. Poor spinsters were running households on their own wages. Both were surviving outside the marriage market, and sometimes thriving. The new woman may have been drawn in magazines with a bicycle and a copy of Ibsen, but she looked just as often like a seamstress in a shared flat, holding her own against poverty with resilience and humour. Spinsterhood wasn't withering, it was evolving. And the more society tried to laugh, the more spinsters turned the joke back on them. Because if mocking didn't work, society had one last trick up its sleeve: inventing new names to shame you into submission. You're at a dinner when someone calls you a thornback. Excuse me? A fish? Yes. Apparently once you pass 30, you transform from a delicate flower into a spiny flatfish that nobody wants to eat. It's less of an insult, more of a menu item. You smile sweetly and reply, "Better a thornback than a jellyfish who folds at the first sign of responsibility." Then you refill your wine glass and toast to your gills. Wealthy spinsters like you are expected to wilt at this kind of nickname. Instead, you bought more books, ordered another set of curtains, and lived long enough to see half the men who mocked you buried in the churchyard. Poorer spinsters heard the same insult while sewing 14 hours a day, or running boarding houses full of tenants. Did they care if society thought they resembled a bony fish? Hardly. They were too busy keeping themselves and half their relatives alive. So yes, you're a thornback. And you've decided that if society insists you're a fish, you'll be the kind that swims upstream, bites ankles, and never gets caught. Victorians had a talent for creative cruelty. Women who remained unmarried past their 20s were branded with nicknames: old maid, redundant, thornback. The last one, borrowed from fishing slang, was especially vicious, a way of saying you'd aged past usefulness. Satirical papers like Punch drew endless cartoons of unmarried women as frumpy, bitter, and cat-obsessed. Wealthier spinsters, with their incomes and independence, were lampooned as frivolous eccentrics wasting away in empty parlours. Poorer spinsters were pitied, or mocked, as lonely garret dwellers. The insult worked better in theory than in practice. In reality, wealthy thornbacks like Barbara Boduchon and Florence Nightingale were funding schools running reforms and reshaping professions. Working-class thornbacks were seamstresses, governesses, or teachers who kept households afloat on their wages, often supporting nieces, nephews, or aging parents. So while society laughed at women for being fish, those same women were running classrooms, reform committees, and industries. The joke rang hollow when the redundant ones were keeping the wheels turning. Humour remains in the desperation. Men had to call them names to maintain control. If they admitted the truth, that women could live, work, and thrive without husbands, the whole premise of Victorian marriage looked shaky. So they resorted to cat jokes and fish jokes. Meanwhile, the spinsters wrote essays, chaired meetings, paid bills, and frankly outlived most of their critics. Which makes you wonder, who exactly was the thornback? Because behind the stereotypes and the snide cartoons, the spinsters were keeping diaries, and those diaries told a story much funnier, freer, and sharper than society ever dared to imagine. You sit down at your writing desk, open your diary, and let out a sigh of relief. Not because you're lonely, not because you're pining, but because it's blissfully quiet and no one is demanding to know where their trousers are. You write, "Another glorious day of not having to ask permission to exist." Victorian society assumes you're filling these pages with tears and pressed flowers. In reality, you're making lists of all the things you didn't have to endure. No snoring, no mansplaining. No conversations about the superiority of boiled beef. Your married cousin sighs about companionship. You write in your diary, "She looked pale, possibly from overwork, or possibly from listening to her husband explain parliamentary procedure with bread rolls." You're not writing tragedies, you're writing comedy. And the punchline is always the same: you regret nothing. Spinster diaries and letters give us a clearer picture than any stereotype ever did. Far from being pitiful, many Victorian unmarried women wrote with wit, confidence, and even joy about their independence. Private writings reveal spinsters who were satisfied with their choices, often noting the burdens they avoided. Some explicitly compared marriage to servitude. Others described spinster life as restful, free, and even luxurious. One anonymous woman wrote in her journal that she had escaped the fate of endless labour for another's benefit. Another, quoted in an 1889 issue of Titbits, quipped that men were less affectionate than a cat and less amusing than a monkey, proof that the stereotype of bitterness sometimes masks pure comic honesty. For wealthier spinsters, diaries often celebrated the autonomy to read, write, travel, and spend their money as they wished. For poorer women, journals and letters reflected pride in surviving on their own wages, however modest. They wrote about sewing late at night, teaching classes, or running small households with other women. Not glamorous, but still free from the demands of unreliable husbands. The humour in these records is subtle, but unmistakable. These women weren't deluded. They knew exactly how society saw them, and they responded with dry observations, biting jokes, and occasional gleeful satisfaction that they'd sidestepped a trap. Diaries don't show regret, they show perspective, and the verdict, written in neat Victorian ink, is clear. Spinsterhood wasn't failure, it was freedom, and often a very funny one. Because as spinsters documented their quiet victories, they also left something else behind. A legacy. One that would ripple far beyond their diaries into the future of women's rights. You walk past your shop, your house, or your study, and you smile. Not because someone finally proposed, but because you've made a life that doesn't need the approval of a man with gravy on his waistcoat. You're unmarried, you're solvent, you're alive, and contrary to every warning pamphlet and worried sermon, you've not turned into a tragic relic in a garret. Instead, you've turned into something far more alarming, an example. Your nieces and students look at you and think, maybe I don't have to marry the first man who asks. Your neighbours notice that you live alone and, shockingly, don't burst into tears over it. And younger women whisper that your life, with its quiet, its books and its freedom, looks awfully appealing. The legacy you're leaving is not a lace doily or a sad parlour, it's possibility. And that possibility is more scandalous than anything else. The Victorian spinster stereotype was meant to diminish women, to brand them as redundant, pitiful or laughable. But the real legacy of spinsters was far different. Wealthy spinsters funded education, housing reform and hospitals. Florence Nightingale, Octavia Hill and Barbara Bodishan changed public health, urban housing and women's legal rights. Their independence wasn't a waste, it was a resource. Poorer spinsters, though less visible in history books, left their mark too. They kept schools running, supported entire families on meagre wages, and proved that women could survive without a husband's income. Their resilience built quiet examples for the next generation. You could work, live with other women, and make a life without marriage. The stereotype of the bitter old maid failed because it couldn't smother reality. Diaries, letters, and community records show spinsters laughing, building, and thriving. They didn't regret their choices. They used them. By the end of the 19th century, the so-called redundant women had shown society something uncomfortable. Marriage was not inevitable, nor was it essential. Women could live outside the mould. They could create lives of purpose, autonomy, and influence, and sometimes they could create lives that were simply peaceful, which was radical enough. Their legacy wasn't silence, it was a crack in the system. A reminder to future generations that spinsterhood was not failure. It was freedom rebranded. And as later women campaigned for suffrage, professional rights and equality, they built on the examples spinsters left behind. The joke, it turns out, didn't survive. The women did. And so, as the last laugh fades from the caricatures and cartoons, what remains is the truth. Spinsters weren't redundant or tragic or fish. They were women who lived on their own terms, and in a society that demanded otherwise, that was the greatest legacy of all. And now, as the final teacup is drained, and the parlour glows with the warm haze of embroidery threads and other people's bad opinions, I hope this ridiculous little tour through Victorian spinsterhood lingers. Like the aftertaste of cold porridge served with a side of judgment. You've survived pity disguised as compliments, relatives who won't stop whispering "poor thing," suitors with the personality of damp wallpaper, and enough lectures about your wasted youth to power a small factory. But for now, it's time to rest. The neighbours have stopped peeking through the curtains, the marriage manuals are back on the shelf and the cat has taken your spot in bed. Because of course it has, if you're still awake. Impressive. You've just endured history's most exhausting group project in female respectability. And you weren't even invited to the wedding. Hit subscribe so we can unlace another tale of polite social panic tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from matchmaking disasters and marital scoldings, and into sleep.